Hey kids, this is a great story about giving to people. It's called The Spiffiest Giant in Town. And George learns a lesson. The Spiffiest Giant in Town by Julia Donaldson. George was a giant. He was the spiffiest giant in town. He always wore the same pair of old brown sandals and the same old patched up gown.
I wish I wasn't the scruffiest giant in town,
He said sadly. He's not feeling really good about what he dresses like. It looks like other people dress up pretty nice, but he doesn't have really good looking clothes. And he's feeling icky about himself. But one day, George noticed a new shop. It was full of spiffy clothes. So he bought a spiffy shirt, a spiffy pair of pants and a spiffy belt, a spiffy striped tie, and some spiffy socks with diamonds down the side, and a pair of spiffy shiny shoes.
Now I'm the spiffiest giant in town,
he said proudly. George left his old clothes behind in the shop. He was about to go home when he heard a sound. On the sidewalk stood a giraffe who was sniffing sadly.
What's the matter?
asked George. Look how nice he looks. It's all spiffy.
Oh, it's my neck, said the giraffe. It's so very long and so very cold. I wish I had a long, warm scarf.
They're looking eye to eye to each other. That's a pretty tall man.
Cheer up,
said George, and he took off his striped tie.
It didn't match my socks anyway, he said,
and he wound it around and around the giraffe's neck. It made a wonderful scarf.
Thank you,
said the giraffe. George strode home and he sang to himself,
My tie is a scarf for a cold giraffe, but look me up and down, I'm the spiffiest giant in town.
He looks pretty good. Even the little young lady's looking at him. Much better. So George came over to a river. On the boat stood a goat who was bleating loudly.
What's the matter?
asked George. Oh, it's my sail, said the goat. It blew away in the storm. I wish I had a strong new sail for my boat. What can George do?
Cheer up,
said George, and he took off his new white shirt.
It kept coming untucked anyway, he said,
as he tied it to the mast of the goat's boat. It made a magnificent sail. Thank you, said the goat. George strode on, singing to himself.
My tie is a scarf for a cold giraffe. My shirt's on a boat for a sail for a goat. But look me up and down, I'm the spiffiest giant in town.
Still looks kind of good, kind of spiffy. George came to a tiny ruined house. Beside the house stood a white little mouse with lots of baby mice. They were all squeaking.
What's the matter?
asked George. It's our house, squeaked the mother mouse. It burned down, and now we have no place to live. I wish we had a nice new house. What could George do?
Cheer up,
said George, and he took off one of his shiny shoes.
It was giving me blisters anyway,
he said, as the mouse and her babies scrambled inside. The shoe made a perfect home for them. Thank you, they all squeaked. George had to hop along the road now, but he didn't mind. As he hopped, he sang to himself.
My tie is a scarf for a cold giraffe. My shirt's on a boat for a sail for a goat. My shoe is a house for a little white mouse, but look me up and down. I'm the spiffiest giant in town.
Well, his hair's getting all fuzzy. George came to a campsite. Beside a tent stood a fox who was crying.
What's the matter?
Asked George. Oh, it's my sleeping bag, said the fox. I dropped it in the puddle, and I wish I had a warm, dry sleeping bag.
Cheer up,
said George, and he took off one of his socks, and the one with the diamonds on the side.
It was tickling my toes anyway,
he said, as the fox snuggled into it. It made a very fine sleeping bag. Whoa, thank you, said the fox. George hopped along singing to himself.
My tie is a scarf for a cold giraffe. My shirt's on a boat for a sail for a goat. My shoe is a house for a little white mouse. One of my socks is a bed for a fox. But look me up and down. I'm the spiffiest giant in town.
Does he look very spiffy? He has one shoe, and his hair is a mess, and he lost his shirt and his sock. What he thought was making him spiffy. George came to a squishy bog. Beside the bog stood a dog who was howling.
What's the matter?
Asked George. Oh, it's this bog, said the dog. I need to get across, but I keep getting stuck in the mud. I wish there was a safe, dry path. Oh boy, what can George do?
Cheer up,
said George, and he took off his spiffy new belt.
It was squeezing my tummy anyway,
he said, as he laid it over the bog. It made an excellent path.
Thank you,
said the dog. The wind started to blow, but George didn't mind. He hopped on singing to himself. He's just a happy little guy.
My tie is a scarf for a cold giraffe. My shirt's on a boat for a sail for a goat. My shoe is a house for a little white mouse. One of my socks is a bed for a fox. My belt helped a dog who was crossing the bog. But my pants are falling down, and I'm the coldest giant in town.
Oh no, he gave everything up, and now he's not so happy. Suddenly George felt sad and shivery and not all that spiffy. He stood on one foot and thought,
I'll have to go back to the shop and buy some more clothes,
he decided. He turned around and he hopped all the way back to the shop. But when he got there, it was closed.
Oh no,
cried George, and he sank down on the sidewalk, and a tear ran down his nose. He felt as sad as all the animals that he had met on his way home. And then out of the corner of his eye, he saw a bag with something familiar poking out of it. George took a closer look.
My gown, he yelled. My dear old gown and sandals.
George put them on and he felt wonderfully comfortable.
I am the coziest giant in town,
he cried, and he danced back home along the road. Clothes The spiffy clothes didn't make him feel any better. Outside his front door stood all the animals that he had helped. They were carrying an enormous present. "Come, George," they all said. "Open it." George untied the ribbon. Inside was a beautiful gold paper crown and a card. "Look inside the card, George," said the animals. George put on his crown on his head, and he opened the card. Inside it said, "You gave your scarf to a cold giraffe. Your shirt on a boat is a sail for a goat. Your shoe is a house for a little white mouse. One of your socks is a bed for a fox. Your belt helped a dog who was crossing a bog. So here's a very fine crown to go with the sandals and your gown. To the kindest giant in town." Boys and girls, that was the end. So, did George really need all those things to make him feel good? I think he was missing friends. And so, at the end of this story, he found friends that really saw who he was and noticed that he had a big heart to share. You guys have a good day, and maybe you can share your heart with someone else today. Have a good one.